How are you guys doing? Let's do a thumbs up, neutral, or thumbs down. Wow, okay, everybody's great. Okay, we have one person who's a little tired. I'm the last long presentation. No, we're not naming names. That's why you sit in the front. Well, thank you, Hugh and Richard and everybody else, all the organizers, for making this happen. And thank you for giving me a chance to share my love and passion for transit maps. So a little bit about myself. I graduated with a degree in statistics, and most of my full-time work has been in data analysis and data science. So I'm very much a hobbyist when it comes to cartography and transit mapping. Although initially I started off just making sort of fun little maps that I would share on social media, and some of those, as many of you guys had a similar experience, some of those turned into sort of real job opportunities. So it's very interesting what's possible out there. So I'm going to meander a little bit today. I want to talk about the Roman roads project that I did a few years ago. I think there was some interest yesterday, and I just want to kind of go over the background and the design process a little bit and just kind of share how it got to where it did. And then I want to go into what I learned from that, not just in terms of the actual practice of Adobe Illustrator and things like that, but more in terms of the philosophy and the worldview and how it applies today. So I'm putting in this slide because I realize we are in Asia and not everybody is extremely into European history, and so I've had to explain what the Roman roads are. So the Roman Empire created a strategic network of military roads that looked like this. They were extremely durable. Some of them still exist almost 2,000 years later. They were for military reasons, and we can play a fun game later. Name any major government transportation project, and I'll tell you why it was actually a military project. So we can do that later. But it was really sort of ahead of its time in a lot of ways in terms of the standardization, the straightness of the routes, the markers at regular intervals that actually had some sort of design language to them, and the state-run postal system that operated at very specific intervals. So that's kind of what the Roman roads are. And the the question that you should never ask a creative person is, where do you get your ideas from, right? Nobody knows. So I have no idea how I came up with this concept of doing this. I just thought, okay, maybe ancient Rome is cool and it's something that sort of feels like a transit system, so why not try to represent it in the style of a modern transit map, right? And at that point, I had no experience whatsoever designing or making any kind of transit maps. I had some experience with other types of cartography, but I had no experience with transit maps whatsoever. And so, you know, I just got started. And so I would say if anyone here is sort of considering trying it or is unsure or whatever, it's like, you know, just start, just do it. And you'd be surprised after a few iterations where you can end up. So version 1, I actually don't have a picture of it. It was really bad. I wish I had a picture of it so you could see the evolution. I just couldn't find it on my computer. But no matter what I tried, it just didn't work. It didn't look good. And eventually I realized that maybe the best thing for me to do is just to completely steal the style of an existing transit map. So what I did is I copied the London Underground. So this is version 2, and those of you who might have seen the final version, not everyone has seen this version. Some people actually prefer this version. It's very complex. It has a lot of the features that the London Tube map has in terms of zones and obviously the style with the transfer stations and the notches. And it's also somewhat more tied to the geography, I would say. For example, if you look now at the coast of Africa, you'll see that there's some attempt to represent the geography. But I showed this to people and to my friends, especially people who were not cartographers or history nerds. And I made a different version that was much simpler, which is this. And people like this one much better. So I've noticed on Twitter and stuff, the transit nerds actually like this one more, but the normal people like this one. And you can see that the coast of North Africa there is much, much more simplified. So just as an example of some of the simplifications that were done. So this was the original. This became very popular, and this inspired me. The success of this map in the social media space inspired me to keep creating more and more different maps, specialized by region. So the first region that I decided to do was Britain, because I received a lot of communication from people in Britain. And it's funny, I think despite the fact that Britain was the periphery of the Roman Empire, British people are very proud of what Roman heritage they do have. And so, I followed the excitement and created this. And you can see that this is a slight evolution of the previous style. Some of the changes include, the line thickness, as well as the way that the sea is represented. There are some additional elements there, like the arrow in Belgium, pointing to Colonia Agrippina, which I think is modern-day Köln, actually. And this version just has the old names, wherever we do have them. Obviously, Braintree is not a Latin word, but there is a different version that I made that contains the Latin name and then the modern name in smaller text. So following the Britain map, I decided to make one of Italy, because that was probably the second most excited sort of audience. And here, again, it's sort of another evolution. I actually went back to representing the ocean as solid blue, which I think is sort of more intuitive and maybe even calming to some extent. And I added little Easter eggs. So I will confess, I didn't know the term spider map until yesterday. But I think I accidentally made one about 5 years ago. So this inset of the city of Rome shows sort of a very stylized depiction of how the city was organized, and it shows all the routes and how they actually emerged out of the city. And then you can see there's a little Easter egg with Pompeii. So Vesuvius is in there as a little icon, and the Pompeii station is closed, unfortunately. One other interesting evolution of the style here is, you might notice the, Volturnus River. I actually don't know which one that is in what the modern name is. But originally when I made the rivers, I made them very light blue, and they were just straight lines. And I realized that this was actually clashing with the transit network, if you will. It looked as if it was a road that was just light blue. So by giving it this random wavy pattern, first of all, it very intuitively is a river now. People clearly understand that it's water that's flowing. But also it no longer competes with the straight lines that represent the roads. Another final interesting detail here is that in Roman times, and arguably in modern times as well, Sicily and Sardinia were not considered part of Italia. So I had some angry emails from people asking why I didn't put Sicily and Sardinia in white like the rest of Italy, and I said, well, sorry, but the Romans did not consider them to be part of Italy. So I'll go back for a second. So you'll see here that for the most part, these roads are similar to a modern road network in the sense that the nodes are cities, and between the cities there will be, one road, one route connecting city A to city B. We don't have as many roads running in parallel here in Italy. And as I tackled the next region, which is Iberia, Spain and Portugal, I realized that the way the Roman roads were structured in that area were a little bit different. So the Romans actually had very long tables of itineraries and route tables. And so these routes that I made here, these are not, fictional. These are actually discrete roads that existed in the Roman consciousness in the Roman system. And in Spain, you'll notice, I magnified it here, in several cases, these routes would run along the same segment of actual track or a physical roadway. So basically, I wasn't able to use this style. I had to adapt it, and I came up with this sort of thing. Now, this map is kind of funny because I actually, maybe you can guess where I started drawing it and where I ended drawing it. So I started in the top right, where it looks all nice and neat, and I ended in the bottom left, where it's a little bit more cluttered. Because by this point, I was still doing it very spontaneously. I really wasn't putting much effort into pre-planning the layout or anything like that. This one was very popular in Spain because a fun fact is that the city of Madrid, I think it existed in Roman times, but not really. It was essentially didn't exist in Roman times. And so Spaniards enjoyed the fact that the transit network prioritized, the Mediterranean corridor and Seville and Cordoba and things like that at the expense of Madrid, which, is typically the opposite of the reality that they're in. So that was something that I didn't know about previously, but it was kind of funny to hear that. And then finally, this Gaul map was the last one that I made before I got too tired. Each map took progressively more and more time, as you can imagine, because I was taking it more and more seriously as an exercise in just getting the hang of using certain design styles and practicing the act of making these maps. So this really is sort of the culmination. It's you could say it's overwrought compared to the very first original. But certainly it has some elements that I think look really good. And this has the same situation as Spain, so certain routes, certain itineraries will overlap with other itineraries. And the reality is if you think back to the first map, there's not that many actual roads. There were many, many more Roman roads than were shown on the first map. And so here, what I decided to do is for the roads that existed but were not named, I just indicated them in thin brown lines here. And then I also included well-known marine connections with the blue lines. And you could see the same thing with the rivers. So basically using everything that I knew previously up to that point to create this. And let me see. Did I include? Oh, I didn't include it. Well, I didn't include the images, unfortunately, but I'll share my Instagram later. If you scroll back on my Instagram, you'll see the design process for this map was much more extensive, especially in the northern region, kind of around modern Paris and Calais. There was quite a lot of pencil sketching and using dotted paper and things like that to arrive at a good layout before finally committing to actually doing it digitally. So I'd be curious later to hear how other people do it, hobbyists, professionals, but my process actually does involve quite a bit of pencil and paper first before actually switching to Illustrator. So aside from obviously learning, practicing and learning the actual act of creating transit maps, I really gained an appreciation for the ancient worldview when it comes to movement, transportation, travel, and geography. The Romans, as I mentioned, had these itineraries, they had these charts, and they really thought of space as qualitative, heterogeneous, excuse me. So not all spaces are equal. They thought of space as hierarchical and centered. The center would be Rome, if we're talking on an imperial scale. And space is relational and experiential. And the experiential part is extremely important, and I think a lot of the people here understand that very well, right? What really ultimately matters is the experience of the user or the passenger or the traveler, and the Romans understood that very well. And I mentioned other, the Greeks, the Islamic. So really everyone basically before modernity, before the Enlightenment, before modern times, uh, thought this way. And I know China is conspicuously missing from this, but hold your horses, right? I'll get there. So this is a lot of people who are into design studies or transit map studies are familiar with this. This is a 13th century copy, but it depicts an actual Roman document. Historians disagree as to whether it was early empire, middle empire, but believe it or not, this is one of the types of maps that was more prevalent in Rome. And it's very hard to tell what is being shown here, but I'll show you in the next slide. So each of these is a connection between cities. And you could see these little icons here representing towns. And so this is how Romans thought of geography, right? Not in the way that we think of it in terms of latitude and longitude. They had the technology. In fact, the ancient Greeks had latitude and longitude. They just didn't use it. They didn't care. It wasn't necessary for them because they were focused on the experience of the actual person. Yeah, so here is what this map is actually showing. It's kind of crazy, right? So you see Turkey and Cyprus there in the Black Sea. Now squish it, compress it down, and that's pretty much what this is. So that sort of egg-shaped island there, that's actually Cyprus. So that really shows you how much the Romans were willing to actually distort the geography. I think much more so than many of us here in this room. Some other examples. This is a world map from the first century. And again, it's easy for us in our modern ways to think, oh, they just weren't that good at measurement. They just didn't have the technology to create good maps. But that's not true. They literally did. They understood geometry. They understood trigonometry, latitude, longitude. Everyone, certainly every educated person by this point in the Roman history, knew that the Earth was actually spherical and that it existed in a sort of a heaven consisting of many spherical bodies. So they were actually much more advanced than we would give them credit for in that understanding. And yet, you have maps like these, which are very clearly distorted. But they're distorted in a way that makes sense, right? Because what's at the center? We have Italia and Greece, the two centers of the Mediterranean world at the time. And everything else filters out in a circular pattern from there. And then this one, this is really interesting. I had this example before. There's no way to tell what this is just looking at the map here on the right. But actually, yeah, and it's quite beautiful. This is a fragment of a shield, or actually a leather cover that goes onto a shield. And the blue area does represent water. You can see a boat there. And the brown area represents land. And there's a circular pattern, kind of like a ring line, with cities dotting the edge of that line. And it's amazing what that actually represents, right? So rotate it, and that red segment there is the segment that's actually represented on that piece of leather. So again, thinking of things in a schematic way, this actually represents a soldier's route that he traveled, and he had it inscribed on his shield. Now, it would be remiss not to slightly scratch the surface of the Chinese view of things, because I've been focusing on sort of Western Christian Roman civilization. There are some complications. So in the Western or the sort of Abrahamic European example, we really don't see geographically precise maps until the Renaissance, roughly. Maybe 1500s, maybe a little bit earlier than that. In China, we actually do see very precise geographical maps as early as the 1st or even 2nd century BC. So Chinese maps have always been geographical. So that doesn't really support the thesis, right? That all the ancients viewed the world in schematic terms. But actually, it turns out that that's, it all falls in line once you really analyze it. And of course, yeah, obviously China has a different history and progression of thought from Europe, right? And so things like classical antiquity, the Renaissance, it's going to be a little bit different on this side of the world. But nonetheless, all three of the things that I mentioned about how the Romans and Greeks viewed the world are still true. Space is still heterogeneous. You have holy spaces, pure spaces, chaotic spaces, ordered spaces. It's not just space, right? Space is hierarchical and centered. So, I mean, perhaps even more so, actually, than in the West, right? I mean, the Middle Kingdom, that's all you need to know, right? The middle. And space is experiential as well. So the Yugong document is one of the earliest sort of classical Chinese geographical documents, and it really gives a window into how the geography was viewed, and it's tracing the steps of King Yu. So it's literally following an actual individual person's footsteps, right? So it's their experience. So even though there are some differences and some nuances when it comes to Chinese understanding of space versus European or Middle Eastern, nonetheless, these three sort of ancient truths are still held in common. So these maps are from very early, right? So 168 BC or even earlier. And these are actually quite precise topographical maps. They were made for military purposes, as are most, if not all, topographical maps. And so this really kind of goes, there was nothing like this anywhere west of the Tian Shan for 1,500 years, right? So this is really different from what we would see in the Mediterranean. But nonetheless, these were for a specific purpose. They were for defense against a neighboring kingdom. They were to plan military movements. And I think that scholars who cite this overemphasize the geographical nature of it. I mean, yes, it is geographical, but I mean, it really is quite stylized. I don't have to explain it. I think it's quite clear, especially the one on the right. Yes, it is sort of latitude, longitude, somewhat pretty consistent, but at the same time, there's still very much a lot of choice as to what to include and what not to include, and you're including the things that are relevant for military movements, so mountains, forests, rivers, right? And you're not including other things. But in addition to maps like that, which were for military purposes, there were also maps like this. And this is crazy because this is a tracing of a photograph of a Japanese copy of an imported document from the Tang Dynasty. So we don't have the original. But to the best that we can discern, we have this extremely schematic representation of, you could say, Eurasia, something like that, where it's almost like a topological sort of description of which countries border which other countries. And note that we don't have an exact date on this, but it's somewhere in the Tang Dynasty, so approximately, most likely before 1000 AD. Contrast that with this, which is from 1136 AD. I believe that would be the Song Dynasty. And so I mentioned that China and Europe have very different progressions in terms of history of science and things like that. In Europe, we had the Renaissance. China had a sort of a Renaissance during the Song Dynasty, especially around 1100 AD when this map would have been produced. And so I'm really glossing over a lot of stuff here, so please forgive me. But basically, in the same way that Europe transitioned from a more experiential model of viewing the self and viewing the world from the perspective of a human being to shifting to sort of a more scientific or scientistic materialist way of thinking right around between 1500 to 1900. Obviously, it took time, right? But there was something of a similar movement in China a few hundred years earlier. And so yeah, so we see this map, which is remarkably accurate. It's a little bit distorted. There's a paper here from 2012 that tries to georeference it, and this actually, it uses a gnomonic projection, so you'll see that the bottom there is a little bit sort of expanded out. But aside from that, it's actually, it really is quite accurate. And this was used for measuring distances between cities, planning logistics, and things like that. So sort of administrative, bureaucratic purposes. But here's the interesting thing, is that this isn't purely a geographical map. I mentioned the sort of ancient classical Chinese geographical texts. And they were still obviously very highly respected and followed even in this time period where methods of thinking were shifting. And so despite the fact that it does map reasonably quite well onto sort of a modern digital representation there are certain elements, and I won't go into it, but there's a paper that you can read, but there are certain things that are sort of mythical or legendary or in some cases actually wrong in the classical document, but those landmarks are retained. It's very hard to see, but there's a bunch of text actually all over this map. Those classical mythological elements are actually still retained on this otherwise geographical map. Also, interestingly, the island of Hainan is kind of misplaced, misshapen. It's a bit hard to see. It falls right on that seam there, but you could see that the yellow outline is considerably farther south, the actual position, compared to where it is drawn on the map. And the theory is that it just didn't fit, so they just moved it up so that it fit, which is something that we do all the time, right? But it shows that even though there was a shift to sort of geographical mapping for certain utilitarian purposes, there was still this element of pragmatism and sort of experiential thinking. So even in places like China, and I'm sorry, I didn't mention India. I know there's the three, right? I think I'm tired, I think that could be a topic for another talk, right? But it's fair to say that pretty much everyone in pre-modern times viewed the world in these experiential ways. And that the modern sort of Google Maps, nautical chart is how it started, eventually sort of military and all that way of representing the world is really an anomaly. It's not something that comes naturally to the human mind. It's something that requires quite a bit of technology and abstraction and advancement to even be able to create, right? And so I pulled this up because yesterday, in the talk, it was mentioned that the Hong Kong MTR map is quite distorted. But I would really, and I'm not being facetious here, I'm actually really would like to challenge you. Which map is actually distorted? And if it's like the what is it, blue and black versus gold and white dress, right? If you have trouble seeing that the Google Maps screenshot is distorted, I think that is going to be a severe limitation on your ability to solve navigation and provide solutions. So I really would challenge everyone to try to see that this map on the right is actually distorted. And so, yeah, so until we can reach that point mentally of opening Google Maps, Apple Maps, looking at even a satellite image, and thinking to ourselves, yeah, this is good, this is useful for some things, but it's actually distorted. Just like the MTR map is also distorted, right? Until we reach that point, I really think we're going to be limited, and I am a bit of an extremist on this position. Things are changing, right? The anomaly that I talked about in terms of really the map making, but not just map making, publishing, information, media. These used to be very centralized technologies that were controlled by institutions that just so happened to be very materialistic and very scientific in their outlook. But this is sort of falling away very quickly, actually, before our eyes. I think everyone is aware of this. It's kind of scary, but chaos is, the opposite side of opportunity, right? It's the same thing. So, story is back, right? We no longer think of things as this is just the scientific fact, right? People are really, at least in North America, in the West, people are really going away from that mindset. So now it's not so much like, is this scientifically true or not? It's, what's the story, right? Because science itself is a story. Do we trust science, right? So story is back. So if we don't make maps, signs, materials that correspond to the lived experience of people, and also importantly, not just transit map enthusiasts, not just cartographers. My wife is totally spatially different from me, and it's been very interesting sort of comparing the ways, our brains work. Yeah, I see some appreciation here, because there are people, whose minds work totally differently than most people in this room. And we also have to keep that in mind as well, and map according to our experience, their experience, and not be afraid to sort of transgress some of these sort of old scientific boundaries. So I'm sure most of the people in this room are already comfortable sort of twisting and tweaking and modifying things a little bit. I really appreciated the segment of Ilya's presentation where he showed that they would tweak the base map of Tashkent to match the lines rather than the other way around. So I really appreciated that. I think that's the right move. This is, some of you may know this, is like, I think 100 people were asked to draw a map of the world from memory, just regular people, right? And you can see, right, if you think that you're distorting something a little too much, just think of this chart, right? This is how normal people see a world map. It's nothing like geography, really. Almost very cursory resemblance, right? So don't be afraid to really tweak it. And if you're not sure if you're tweaking something too far, just ask a bunch of people, not history nerds, cartography nerds, just regular people. Ask them, like, does this make sense? Or ask them, it's a fun exercise actually, to draw a map of their hometown just from memory. It's very interesting, the results that you get. So I would encourage everyone to run that exercise with a friend or a family member. And those of us who work in sort of more interactive applications, GIS, that type of stuff, I understand that some of it is for sort of security or defense purposes, and in that case, of course, you need the spatial aspect. But in other cases, especially in terms of navigation, I really think that the thing that's going to disrupt Google Maps, I tried to convince Apple Maps last time. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it this time. But if you want to disrupt that, you really have to create again, I think as Ilya mentioned, a sort of a multi-scale schematic map vector tile service. It's extremely difficult. I think a lot of people have tried, and no one has succeeded yet. But once that gets nailed down, that's going to be the future of mapping, because you're no longer tied to the geography. You can create a map of, for example, what is the safest route? What is the prettiest route? What is the route that passes by, things that I can use as markers, right? We tried this on a city scale, but with technology, with phones, I know we talked about paper maps versus digital. I'm sorry, but I don't think paper maps are going away. But just based on my experience and the experience of my friends, I honestly think the future of navigation and wayfinding is going to be your phone. Yes, it's annoying to hold while you're holding luggage, but it's just what we're used to now. I don't know. It's just what people do. And that personalized navigation tool is going to contain the instructions that you need to, go 100 feet straight. Look at, make a left at the 7-Eleven, and then you'll find the bus stop or whatever, which Yo and I couldn't find yesterday. So that is my challenge to the transit mappers and the GIS mappers, is we have to sort of loosen up and get comfortable with making more maps that look like this. So thank you for your attention. And I forgot to mention, so I joked that I was a retired cartographer. So I haven't done much in the space in the last couple of years, but being here, I think I'm very inspired. I think I'm going to sort of start back up again. So feel free to follow my Twitter, my Instagram. They've been dormant for a couple of years, but if you want to connect, please go ahead and do that. So they disappeared. So I hope you caught it. But thank you again.